Chances are if I brought up Attack on Titan, the first thing that comes to your mind would be something from the final arc of the series. Fans call it the War for Paradise arc, and it spans from when our characters exit Marley to the very ending of the series, 33 chapters and 30 episodes. This vast epic feels like the true story AOT wanted to tell, and everything else was merely set up for this arc. That said, it's also a controversial arc with some very controversial parts. I think that's natural. It's extremely ambitious with enormous stakes and grand lofty ideas, not to mention it had the responsibility of ending this whole series. Being the case, my opinions on this arc are very mixed. I think it has some of the worst content of the series, but also by far the best. Overall, the one thing I cannot hold against it is its memorability. Even with its worst, it manages to stick with you in a way the few series do, and the high points of this arc cemented the series as one of my favorites. As a complicated arc with a rapidly moving plot, it's definitely going to take a while to explain my fully fleshed out thoughts, but here they are. It's impossible to talk about any event without also referencing future chapters. The whole arc is like a puzzle where we do not fully understand what goes on until the very end. Flashbacks are integral to the structure of the arc, and I'd like to start off with the initial series of flashbacks we get after Eren is in jail. We see the 50-year plan being posed with Paradise needing to sacrifice Historia in order to use a partial rumbling and build up strength. Of course, Eren hates this option, so he urges them to look for alternatives, and they do so, but in the present day we know they come up empty-handed. Now, one thing I can appreciate about AOT, especially post-time skip, is the difficult choices our characters face. They started to be more prevalent after the Uprising arc, but they feel integral to the whole time skip. We see our characters committing atrocities as a result of being locked into options where there will be immense bloodshed regardless. The 50-year plan is another one in these dilemmas. There are risks to it, and it comes at the very uncomfortable cost of having to trap Historia's descendants in a brutal cycle of inheritance. But at the same time, you could very well make the case for it being an effective plan to protect Paradise. It reveals that Paradise, despite having control over the rumbling, does not intend to wipe out the world without provocation, and in my opinion, it's extremely effective at leveraging its power over other countries. Maybe in the worst case scenarios, some countries would probably try to resist the coercion and assassinate the founder or the royal titan, but it's worth noting that even one wrong move would mean their country being eviscerated from the planet. I do think this option is a solid one and is much preferable to the genocide of either side. Another thing I appreciate is how naturally the power system got integrated into the series. The rules of inheritance, the curse of Ymir, the necessity of royal blood, all of these factors are a core element of these plot lines, and it feels like a very real and fleshed out system. That said, I'm not really a fan of this segment of the arc. For context, we see a chapter to there being no alternatives, so they decide to go to Marley themselves and attempt diplomacy. My issue with this is that these events are the justification for why the characters feel cornered and that there's no other option besides sacrificing Historia. But the justification is very half-baked. I'm told that there's no option and they tried everything, but I don't feel that. We don't properly see their attempts at alternatives while we're supposed to be convinced that there are no options as the events of the arc are set in motion. It's left completely off screen until much later, at which point everything has long changed. It's still left unjustified at the beginning of the arc, which is when we needed the justification the most. But even if I pretend we had the flashback earlier, I'm still not convinced. The character's only attempt to search for alternatives was to go to some random pro-Eldian association in Marley. For whatever reason, there's no attempt to have Hizuru help them come into contact with the Middle East or with any of Marley's many enemies and form a temporary alliance with them. It's true that Hizuru sabotaged their chances at contacting other countries, but that's because they want a monopoly on iceberg stones. If the conditions on Paradise's alliance with Marley's rivals would merely be support in taking down Marley, I don't see why Hizuru would have any reason to prevent that. Marley's war with the Middle East was the perfect opportunity to destroy Marley, and I simply would not buy it if the Middle East was so cartoonishly racist that they would pass on the opportunity to receive military support just because it would come from island devils, especially if it's to help them defeat other devils who have been making their lives miserable for decades. There is also no attempt to shift the responsibility from Historia onto Zeke. They did not even attempt to insist that Zeke should produce royal-blooded children and pass his titan onto them, which Paradise can use in the place of Historia. Of course, it's not certain whether Zeke would automatically accept these terms or not, but it's not something that was thought of, acknowledged, or attempted in terms of negotiations. It may or may not work out, but it would be worth a shot. For all they know, the Paradise government could negotiate well and act like they will completely pull out if Zeke does not listen to their demands. Now, one might say that Eren was less committed to finding alternatives, hence his disappearance, and that his disappearance would mess up their attempts to find alternatives, but I do not necessarily think that last part is the case. After all, they're not so short-handed that they can't have a few people search for Eren while having everyone else think of ways to concoct alternative plans in case they succeed in finding Eren. Overall, the impression I get is that this part of the story was very rushed and author Isayama wanted to speed through this part in order to get our characters into a corner. Another issue I have with this section of the story is our main gang. So after spending some time with Reiner as our main character, the arc shifts its focus onto Armin and Mikasa and Connie and John. However, my problem is that I feel a lot less invested in these characters than I was before the time skip. One reason for this is the nature of the mystery box. Pre-time skip, the mystery was the basement, whereas post-time skip, we have Eren Yeager and his motivations and goals. Now, pre-time skip, every time we learn new information about the outside world, it was generally through the eyes of our characters. We learned almost everything alongside them. Contrast this with post-time skip, where we're drip-fed information about Eren separate from our POV characters. Eren's conversation with Reiner, his later interactions with Zeke and Paz, his personal flashbacks, are all completely in the dark from Armin and Mikasa. To be fair, at this point in the story, the only thing we saw from Eren were his conversations with Falco and Reiner, but that's still enough to get far more insight into his psyche than Armin and Mikasa do. Not only that, but there's an imbalance. While we know more than Armin and Mikasa in some areas, they know more than us in other areas. After all, there was a whole 3-year time skip which we only saw glimpses of. We even had a whole important flashback much later on, so that shows we did miss some major details about Eren that Armin and Mikasa knew at this point in the story. All of these create the effect of alienating us from the plot and also alienating us from the characters we're supposed to follow around. However, the much bigger reason why I feel less invested in the characters upon returning to them was because of how little their dynamics were touched upon during the time skip. We did get a flashback about their friendship with Eren, but after season 3 ended, I was excited because I felt that there's a plethora of excellent things to explore. Besides the obvious stuff like the conflict with the outside world, there were numerous character dynamics that I thought were being set up to be elaborated upon. Armin's survivor's guilt from being picked over Erwin is a very interesting bit of character work that the end of season 3 set up, but it wasn't touched upon until much later in the arc. Over the time skip, there's no conversation about Armin and Hanji about his insecurities or Armin and Levi. Levi and Hanji don't even have any conversations about the state of things, her struggling to fulfill the role that was thrust upon her at the end of season 3, or reflections on Erin's death in general. In fact, Levi doesn't even interact with the scouts at all during these flashbacks besides one very funny quip. It's unfortunate because pre-time skip he served as a mentor figure to the scouts and he formed a very tight bond with them. It stands to reason that a situation that's so daunting and foreign even to him would challenge his mentorship role, but none of that is explored because we don't see any proper interactions between him and the rest. It's especially disappointing because Levi was probably my favorite character pre-time skip, and the reason for this was because of his excellent character interactions. Whether it was his familial issues with Kenny, or him guiding the scouts through a morally relativistic world, or his friendship with Erwin, he bounced off of so many characters and produced so much interesting drama that he played a huge part in elevating pre-time skip's quality. But unfortunately, we just don't get that anymore. Honestly, this stays consistent throughout the entire arc. And speaking of the scouts, I was also let down by Flock. Now, I like Flock post time skip. I think he's pretty cool. I like how he latched onto Eren as a devil in order to give meaning to his survival. I like how funny and crazy and determined he is. I like his foiling with Jean. He's fun to watch. But I thought his role in season 3 was particularly interesting. He served as someone to ground our main characters. He was the only non-major character to survive the Shiganshina battle, so he, as a normal person, could see the special treatment our main characters have. He was absolutely correct that Levi was not making a purely rational choice when picking Armin over Erwin, and while Flock was incorrect in thinking that this was due to favoritism, the fact still remains that Levi's reason for picking Armin was not because of some assessment about who is better for humanity. Even if he wasn't on point, it was still nice that it seemed like the series was setting up someone to be a counterbalance to our main characters, someone who could provide a more layman's perspective. It's why it kinda sucked when we got a time skip, then suddenly his dynamic with the group completely shifted off screen and he just became a complete zealot, which felt a lot less unique than his pre-time skip role. However, my biggest disappointment was seeing nothing interesting come out of Armin and Mikasa's relationship. In one of the most emotional moments of the series, Mikasa is fighting tooth and nail to get Levi to pick Armin, but Hanji talks her down and convinces her to let it go. If Levi didn't flip at that very last second, Mikasa would have been complicit in Armin's death. Flock even commends Mikasa for allowing Levi to pick Erwin, and we see a look of horror on her face. This was an incredibly interesting route to take her character as well as her friendship with Armin, and while I do think her decision here was useful in setting up her later decisions, the actual guilt and inevitably complicated feelings of making such a decision when it's your childhood best friend's life on the line was not explored in the slightest post-time skip. All of these and more stack up to me feeling extremely underwhelmed when we return to Paradise after the time skip. What's noteworthy is that these underdeveloped relationships are not unique to War for Paradise, they pervade the whole series besides a couple of specific arcs. However, not only does War for Paradise lack many of these interactions throughout the arc, but they're also missing when we need them the most, which is after we spent years without our characters. The most we get after leaving off with some of the most potentially interesting drama in this series is a couple flashbacks to speed us up to the plot. Then the plot begins to move so rapidly to the point that these can't really be compensated for. There's not enough time. This is the fundamental issue of the arc. It moves at such breakneck speed and balances such a stupidly large amount of characters that it inevitably compromises on many plot points and character dynamics in order to get to the plot beats it wants to reach. I want to move away from the flashbacks and talk about the actual plot happening in the present day. There is a scene where we see Reiner and his little gang talking about the imminent invasion against Paradise by the Global Alliance, but instead of waiting for the whole world to invade Paradise, Reiner presses them to do it now. I think this is a cool character moment. We see Reiner disregarding what's moral and having his flame reignited thanks to Eren in order to prevent the destruction of the world. That said, I unfortunately have to go back to criticism because I am not a fan of this whole plotline. I think the Global Alliance is hands down the single most disappointing part of AOT. What you have here is a coalition of every major country in the world all unanimously deciding that Willie's explanation and Eren's attack on Liberia are enough proof that Eren wants to indiscriminately genocide everybody unprovoked. I understand they're racist and scared of Eren, and I understand that they're friends with Willie, but does it really justify every single major country in the world all being fully convinced that Willie's claims are true? I don't think Willie's friendship should matter that much to politicians who try to assess a situation and gauge their best interests, especially if the ones who call the shots are merely hearing it secondhand from people at the festival. I also don't think it should matter much when this friend literally admitted to having lied about Marley's history for 100 years, when this friend coincidentally only decided to reveal this as his country barely won a war, when this friend has a vested interest in rallying the whole world behind the story about the alien trying to destroy the world, when this friend could easily handle the situation himself without having to involve everyone else. Unless he has some other ulterior motive, maybe? It's true that not everyone was on board until Eren's attack supposedly proved these claims, but does Eren's attack really prove he intends to destroy the world unprovoked but has something mysterious preventing him from doing so? Because even if someone was racist and thought Paradisians were scary and dangerous, they would still undoubtedly need a much higher standard of proof before expending resources on fighting across the whole globe. After all, if they're wrong and it turns out Eren did not already intend to destroy the world, then waging war will surely lead to that outcome. And to me, it really doesn't seem like Eren attacking a military site right after that military declared war is enough proof that he's out to genocide everybody. Even if some countries reach that conclusion, it's absurd for every country to reach that conclusion. Besides that, even if they were correct, even if this was enough proof, is that still enough reason to go to war? After all, Marley can easily defeat Paradise themselves. Why waste a ton of money and resources on a problem that can be dealt with anyway? Plus, other countries pitching in will only delay the invasion and thus increase the chances for the world to be destroyed. This could be remedied if it was more fleshed out and it was shown that maybe some countries were secretly trying to undermine Marley or other countries and they're racing to get the founder before the other parties. Or maybe it was shown that this expedition was not only to get the founder but also to get Paradise's resources right then and there rather than at a later date, meaning any country who joins in would enjoy the spoils. But there's nothing. There's no meat here. It's unfortunate because what we have here is the highest stake conflict of the series up until this point. It's hard to grasp because the series didn't delve into this, but we really have every major country all getting ready to participate in scorching Paradise to the ground. On paper, this sounds incredibly intense. In execution though, unfortunately I felt it was a million times more cheek clenching when a few Titan shifters were battling to take away Eren, and I think it's natural that I, and probably many others, just don't feel the level of tension that this global war should evoke when the arc's focus does not invite that level of tension. Because what we see is the Global Alliance gathering off screen, then we focus on a rush coup happening inside Paradise, then a quick skirmish with some Marley forces, then bam, the rumbling. All it took was 10 chapters of what I just described before this grand war served its purpose. Of course, I need to elaborate on the Jaeger's coup as well, because what initially excited me as the rise of another faction to further complicate the story ended up being a letdown because of, well, usual War for Paradise things. It's kind of a rocky start because of how easily the group seems to be gathered. Hundreds of young members coordinating and becoming a new fully fledged group sounds very difficult in theory, which is why I guess it's convenient that it all happened off screen. I also don't really see what bombing exactly accomplishes besides further antagonizing their enemies, but whatever. They hold a lot of interesting thematic ideas because they're a perversion of themes and motifs that were built up throughout pre-time skip. We see the patriotism of our early scouts transforming into nationalism that only cares about humanity within the walls, and it's really cool to see these ideas take a darker turn once the situation complicates itself. More on this later though. For now, we're stuck with a coup that happens very quickly and very easily with basically no pushback. The most resistance we get is some planning by Pixis to fake a surrender while actually trying to steal the founder from Eren, but of course this arc is allergic to actual political intrigue, so this completely off screen and endured it immediately. This kind of reminds me of another ongoing plotline, this time the warriors being the main offenders here. They sneak onto Paradis off screen without a hitch, then they somehow manage to infiltrate the military. Then when Peak baits Eren into a trap, Porco is just luckily in the perfect position to eat Eren from below. Anyway, the next time we see the Jaegers after they arrest the gang, they have completely taken over Paradis using the wine to threaten everyone. Again, this happens largely off screen and thus concludes the coup. On that note, it's kind of weird that the wine was deployed to blackmail the government, yet the Jaegers never reveal it and only use it when someone else revealed it against their will. Now my point in bringing these up isn't to do some like nitpicky analysis of plot holes and contrivances or whatever, because if that was my goal, this video would be a lot longer, but it's to illustrate the intention of this section of the story. I talked about several major plot points, all rushed, all largely done off screen, all half-baked, because Isayama does not seem to care about these parts of the story. He only uses them as stepping stones to get to the rumbling. It's fine if not necessary to have plotlines exist merely to lead to actual bigger and more important stuff, but it's not often you see this disguised so poorly. Obviously it's natural to brush over some details, but when it happens this much in such a short amount of time, it shows us something is off. This whole first half of the War for Paradis arc is just an awkward intermediary phase between Marley and the rumbling, and because the author has far too much to juggle, he gets in the bare minimum, if not less, than he needs to in order to get to the more exciting plot beats. However, that's not to say this section of the story is deprived of greatness, because it's not. To start off, I really like the wine plotline. There's a cool sense of intrigue and mystery with a payoff that makes perfect sense and integrates the supernatural elements of the show wonderfully. The conversation between Eren, Mikasa, and Armin is pretty interesting too, since it's implied that a lot of Eren's real emotions bleed through over the course of the conversation. Obviously, the point of the talk is to manipulate his friends, and he was largely bluffing, but I don't think Eren thought of Bert stealing Armin's identity out of nowhere. If we consider how much Grisha's memories depress Eren and prevent him from experiencing the outside world properly, I have no doubt in my mind he feels complex about how much these memories diminish his identity and thus his sense of agency. His words to Armin are just a projection. Meanwhile, his aggressiveness towards Mikasa was definitely due to her denying his agency by suggesting Zeke controls him. Something he initially theorized was the case due to his insecurities got twisted into an accusation against Mikasa, denying her agency in response to her denying his. And we know from the ending that he wants Mikasa to move on and forget about her, so his frustration with her attachment to him was likely real. He even says ignorance means no freedom, which is incredibly ironic considering what we learn later on. But besides this scene, I also appreciate the Levi and Zeke plotline. They foil each other well and bounce off of each other decently. You have one character who seeks to end all future generations of Eldians, while another is all about entrusting the future to the next generation. In fact, I love the symbolism of the whole section taking place in a forest. The forest is a motif in the story used to represent warfare, and that it's crucial to keep children out of the forest. Not only is it cool seeing two adults who were traumatized as children facing off in the forest in what is an incredibly gripping fight, but Zeke's line of bringing Gabi and Falco to this forest is symbolic of how much he wraps up children in warfare. It's ironic because his attempt to end the cycle of conflict only further perpetuates it. We see this through his desire to end the Titans, since his method of getting there involves titanizing hundreds of Eldians and helping ravage the world with Titans. I think this is the significance of him being the Beast Titan, the Animal Titan. Season 1 uses animals and the food chain to symbolize the inherent power structures and conflicts that are baked into society. As such, Zeke is meant to represent a perpetuation of the cycle taken to an extreme, which I think this series emphasizes more than it does with other characters due to his alleged power to end the cycle. It's part of the demythologizing that pervades the series due to its focus on understanding. He is hailed as a god who can end the conflict, yet deep down he's just a traumatized kid who is perpetuating the same conflict that broke him. This brings me to his backstory, which is hands down my favorite backstory in the show and possibly my favorite of any anime. It's very hard for me to watch this story about a broken and abused boy without tearing up, and it's tantalizing seeing how various different influences all result in a twisted amalgamation of propaganda that seeks to slow genocide of Eldians. one of the most fascinating glances we get at a character's psyche by seeing how every influence results in his ultimate plan. The first factor is the side of Zeke that internalizes what Grisha preached to him. Of course, Zeke outwardly hates Grisha, but he still subconsciously craves his approval, which is why his euthanasia plan follows Grisha's lectures about Zeke having a mission to save all the Eldians. At the same time, Marley's influence is also a factor. The bigotry he faced as an Eldian living in Marley also had him adopt those bigoted views and conclude that Eldians are threats to the world who are better off not reproducing. There's also his immense suffering and trauma throughout his life that made him wish to never be born. As such, he projects that onto every Eldian and decides that their only path to salvation is never being born. I find this particular motive really interesting because it shows Zeke's low empathy. Throughout the series, time and time again, we see him possessing low emotional intelligence and misunderstanding people. He didn't think Levi would be willing to kill his Titanized friends. He projected his own ideal version of his brother onto Eren. He made his own assumptions about Grisha living in Paradise because he was desperate to find someone to relate to him, and he saw Ymir as a tool rather than as a person. He constantly projects his own ideas and his own experiences onto other people and makes assumptions from there. We also see his low empathy in his treatment of Eldians. He feels zero remorse about the people he kills. He does not make an effort to minimize civilian casualties, and he's actively cruel with his treatment of people like Mike. While he does have grand lofty ideals of saving the Eldians, he possesses a little empathy on a micro level. Part of this is because of his loneliness, which is what makes him project his assumptions onto others in order to make himself feel better, such as projecting onto Eren because he wants a brother, or projecting onto every Eldian possibly to feel less alone in his horrible experiences. The other reason why his empathy is abnormally low is because Grisha's constant prioritization of his mission over his parenting had Zeke internalize the idea that one cannot have strong relationships while also pursuing his mission. This is also why we see him keep a distance from everyone, such as the warriors. He does not let himself get close, which is why it's so poetic that the one time he makes an exception and decides to, by only loving his own ideal image of that person, it ends up being exploited and leading to his downfall. Another factor that leads to him going for the euthanasia plan is his desire to spite Grisha. Grisha's ideas of saving the Eldians involve glory and survival, so for Zeke's idea of salvation to involve the end of the Eldian lineage and for them to slowly die out stands in stark opposition to Grisha's idea of saving them. Zeke is often likened to Karl Fritz in the series, with Eren describing his plan as similar to Karl Fritz preferring to have the Eldians die. In this sense, the series paints Zeke's plan as submissive. Instead of resisting oppression, it intends to have Eldians die out in order to avoid oppression. I see this submissiveness partially as a byproduct of Zeke's inherent personality. Throughout the backstory, we see him preferring a more docile life and not wanting to fight despite everyone pushing him to. Xavier is similar. However, the more time passes, the more we see his suffering pushes him to try and fight anyway. This flashback is a story of how two docile people are pushed to become fighters. Yet despite this, we still see the docile natures play a role in the plan they come up with. It's part of why their plan is not one of pride or survival, but pragmatically giving in to the oppressors in order to avoid suffering. It's yet another way he stands in diametric opposition to Eren. Not only does his more anti-natalist views contrast Eren's hyper-natalism, but his more submissive ideas concerning the Eldian problem enrage Eren. I'll say more about this later because it's really interesting, but the point is that I love these two. One misconception about Zeke that I see often is that he thinks it's good when Eldians die because then they don't have to suffer anymore, but I think this is pretty clearly shown to not be the case. When Eren pretends to agree with Zeke, he says that the civilian casualties of the Liberio attack should not have been born, which implies Zeke sees dying as suffering. There's also the fact that the plan is to sterilize all Eldians, even though it easily could have been to kill all Eldians, and a huge part of Zeke's plan is to ensure Paradise can protect itself for 100 years. It is true he sees benefits to an Eldian dying, namely the fact that the dead Eldian can't reproduce anymore, and this benefit is likely why he's morally okay with killing Eldians as a method to get to his goals, but in a vacuum he seems to see it as a bad thing for an Eldian to die. After all, his goal isn't to wipe out Paradise instantly, it's to have them live out their final days and die of old age. Whether you think this is consistent or not, most anti-natalists are also not pro-death, so I can buy him viewing things this way. I think the fact that we see him become full-on pro-death later on in the series when he's even deeper into his nihilism means that, for now, he's still holding on to some sort of hope or optimism in his life, even if subconsciously, which is why he can't fully commit to the idea of non-existence being good and only has this attitude when it comes to birth. This optimism will probably be due to him still having ambitions and dreams at the this point in time, so his ideal scenario for now is respecting the idea of Eldians living out their lives and fulfilling whatever they want to fulfill. Moving on from Zeke, there's also a whole plotline going on with Gabby's redemption arc. Honestly, I don't really think anything of these chapters. It's predictable, but the restaurant stuff is cool, and it's nice how it intersects with other plot threads like the wine. That said, I don't really think it contributes much thematically. The most it shows is people being deconditioned and breaking their interpersonal cycles of conflict through understanding, but I don't think this adds much considering we see this from the Alliance later on anyway. It's also arguably really swift since we see Gabby, Kaya, and Nicolo all overcoming their grudges within a few days. But while I don't think this plotline is particularly good, I also think it's inoffensive. She also plays a huge role in the battle we see between Marley and Paradis in Shiganshina. This battle was pretty cool, with all the chaos of the preceding chapters culminating in really intense ways. The payoff of the wine plot was heartbreaking, and Gabby sniping Eren only for his head to be caught by Zeke was incredibly surprising, with a beautiful adaptation from the anime. Eren finally reaches paths, and what follows is among the best character work in the series. It's incredibly compelling to watch Zeke be devastated over Eren not fitting his ideal image and his refusal to accept that. It's also perfect that this leads to his downfall, since him waiting to test Eren instead of commanding Ymir ASAP is what eventually led to him losing control over the founder. It's fascinating to watch Eren and Zeke go through Grisha's life as Zeke's claims are dispelled and his worldview is slowly shattered. It's upsetting to watch Zeke realize the life he missed out on and the potential life he could have lived had Grisha come to his senses sooner. It's also an interesting dynamic going on between the three. Zeke's nature and desires mesh better with Grisha's more relaxed and family-oriented life in Paradis, while Eren would have fit Grisha's more determined and prideful self in Marley. You can think of Grisha's internal conflict between duty and family as being represented through Eren and Zeke. Eren represents the dutiful aspect of Grisha, and Zeke represents a familial aspect of Grisha that would rather postpone his mission. It turns out that Eren wins in what is one of the cleverest twists in AOT, when it turns out that the attack titan can see the future. Eren takes advantage of this to push Grisha into foregoing his compassion and completing his mission. Not only did Grisha become more like Eren in the figurative sense of adopting his mission, but he also literally shared the same feelings and experiences as Eren due to being sent Eren's future memories. After his moment of guilt, he eventually slips back and gives the titan to Eren due to Carla's death, which parallels Eren's own quest for vengeance upon her death as well. I genuinely cannot think of a more perfect ability to give the attack titan, especially with how well it integrates with the story's themes. The titan who constantly moves forward, literally moves forward across time. The titan who fights for freedom ironically has a power that traps its users. In a deterministic world, having knowledge of the future strips one other illusion of choice. The twist where Eren manipulates Grisha is outwardly painted as something where Eren is powerful and dominant, but the subtext implies he is trapped. This isn't to say that Eren acted on autopilot and was forced to convince Grisha, but in a closed loop, there is no option for Eren besides convincing Grisha. It was an event that could only happen due to his desires, but his desires were also influenced by his knowledge of what comes after the event. In fact, this whole incident is a microcosm of all of Eren post timeskip. We see time and time again that Eren's future memories fulfill themselves, whether it's through his memories prompting him to walk around a town, thus leading to one of those memories being fulfilled, or having the scenery motivate him to do the rumbling. The implication is that Eren himself is a walking, talking time loop. After all, it's unavoidable that getting this amount of knowledge will affect your actions in some way. What's important to note is that Eren's desires are important, meaning the memory can't be anything. For example, if I saw a future memory of me eating chicken and that vision made me hungry for chicken, then I will be influenced into eating chicken and fulfilling the memory. This is what Eren experiences throughout post timeskip. On the other hand, if I saw a future memory of me eating chicken but I was a strict vegan, the memory will not tempt me into eating the chicken, and so I will not have seen the memory at all. To an extent, the memory has to conform to his desires, but his desires are also influenced by the memory, which is what makes his existence post timeskip so paradoxical. It's predictable to have the freedom-seeking character actually be a slave to his urges, but to introduce a mechanic that traps the freedom seeker into a loop constructed by his urges is next level creative. It communicates his lack of freedom without giving up on his influence over the story, so he's still fun to watch and his actions still give us insight into his psyche. In fact, we see another self-fulfilling prophecy earlier in the series with how the world paints Eren as a devil, and that pushed Eren into becoming the devil they feared, as if to show how humanity's issues can be self-imposed. This parallels nicely with how Eren's lack of freedom is self-imposed through time loops born from his own desires. Another interesting thing that stuck out to me upon reread was a comment by Elena earlier in the arc, where she said that Eren's capabilities are proof that he carries a founding titan. This reminded me a lot of Eren in the Uprising arc, where he initially coped with all the people who died for him by believing that his powers are intrinsic to him through merit. Of course, he learns that this is false because it turns out that he passively inherited it from Grisha, which later leads to him realizing that everyone has inherent worth regardless of their capabilities and he should not trip. What's funny is that Elena's comment here was proven wrong by what we learned in Uprising arc, but then come this twist and she's ironically proven correct again? Was Eren's sadness and Uprising arc over nothing? Well, I don't think it's that straightforward. Eren goes from thinking he got the Titan himself to learning he got it from Grisha to learning he got it from himself again. But the difference is that with the first time he assumed it was due to his own agency and specialness that made him quote-unquote deserve it, while in Paths it ends up being through a closed loop of his own making. It's not evidence of his merit or agency when it's ultimately a loop where he's trapped. This idea compounds even more when you add in the fact that Eren is a byproduct of the world despite his distinct predispositions. In the ending, you see Grisha telling Eren he is free with his eyes resembling that of the Founder Titan. I don't think there was some actual Founder weirdness going on, rather I think it was symbolic of how destiny or the world or whatever you want to call it imposed that role upon him since he was born. He was born into the right environment where his desire for freedom was fostered and where he was eventually given the Founding Titan. In that sense, the ideas by the end of Uprising arc remain intact. It indeed wasn't his own unique ability that got him his Titan. In a broader sense, it was simply him experiencing the right environmental pressures that made him inherit the Founder. Circling back to Yelena's comment, I think her giving the same perspective as a more naive Eren is to contribute to the idea of demythologizing. Her disconnect of Eren and her worship of him as a god leads her to false conclusions about his place in the story. Of course, this is just one example of the Path chapters being rife with humanizing legends, but we'll get to that soon. I also want to point out that the concept of previous themes being subverted to take a darker turn is still very much present. The Uprising arc largely has to do with combating ignorance and bringing humanity inside the walls to an age of knowledge and truth. This is portrayed as good pre-time skip. But while post-time skip AOT still values empathizing with others and deconditioning from propaganda, it calls into question the importance of possessing knowledge. It is knowledge of the future that traps Eren and strips him of his illusion of choice. This also serves as a contrast to pre-time skip ideas of no regrets, whose whole basis is how nobody knows the future, so nobody knows the right choice for sure. Eren's future memories subvert this by showing him the future, which calls into question the concept of right and wrong choices altogether. After all, these ideas are based on a human perception of cause and effect, and if cause and effect is challenged through a merging of the present and the future, then so is our idea of what the right choice is. Eren does not have regrets, and the whole concept of future memories makes that near impossible. Now, he doesn't have full knowledge of the future at this point in time. He still exists in the present, so it's not as if to fully eliminate these concepts and make everything relative, but it begins to challenge what we initially saw pre-time skip. The other noteworthy scene in this chapter is when Grisha apologizes to Zeke and hugs him. Unbelievably poignant payoff. It's such a bittersweet moment for Zeke to finally get the love he craved for so long, but only when it was far too late. What's interesting to note is that Eren deliberately allows this to happen. He's standing at the correct position for Grisha to see Zeke through Eren and lets it go on long enough for them to have their moment. The question we're left with is why? It's left ambiguous, so that lets us speculate and have fun with it. Personally, I think this stems from his feelings of remorse. Eren has spent the last chapter terrorizing Grisha during his last moments, and we are also shown Eren looking somber over the kids he had Grisha murder. He definitely feels guilty about their deaths, but I like to think he also feels guilty about pushing his own father to cause those deaths. Eren doesn't want to back down from any of his goals, so from his point of view, the least he could do is at least let Grisha have this heartfelt moment before his demise. That said, I absolutely do not think he does out of any compassion for Zeke. Even if he allows the hug to happen, he definitely didn't seem to be taking any pleasure from Zeke's catharsis. In fact, he goes out of his way to taunt Zeke about their dad right after the hug ended. Eren seems to despise Zeke in a way that feels unusual for his character. It's definitely because of Zeke's Karl Fritz type ideology, which Eren loathes for its submissiveness. It does make you wonder though. Eren was able to forgive Reiner, so if understanding Reiner made Eren forgive him, and if Eren seems to understand the Fritz point of view, why does he have such a special hatred for the latter ideology even though both of these resulted in his mom's death? Well, it seems to go a lot deeper than just the Eldian issue. Eren in general feels disgusted at the idea of submitting to awful conditions. Even as a child, he referred to people who'd prefer to stay inside the walls as ignorant cattle. It seems to stem from insecurities. The walls make him feel insecure and powerless, but on a deeper level, he also seems to be insecure about his inability to feel satisfied. He's insecure about his feelings of insecurity. After all, if those people are valid, then surely his desire to break free would be foolish, right? This is something Eren feels deep down, but is not something his ego would like to confront. So it manifests as an intense dislike for people who submit. And when this submission threatens the genocide of his people, this dislike becomes bottomless hatred. In retrospect, this low-key makes some things funnier. Imagine how Eren felt when he was accused of not only being controlled, but by Zeke, of all people. Anyway, exiting the chapter, we move on to Ymir Fritz and her backstory. I love the backstory. It's unique with a cool style. It continues the trend of deglorifying legends, and it's fascinating to see that the whole story is simply due to the mental enslavement of a girl who wants to be free. It's cool because we've technically already seen how Ymir was before, and that was through Historia. She based her people-pleasing Krista persona on how Ymir lived. She even visually parallels Ymir in many ways. Many people pointed out how Historia's speech to Eren in Uprising is very similar to Eren's speech to Ymir, convincing her to free herself. Eren is channeling Historia here. I see this as incredibly cool when you take in the parallels, because what we see is Historia breaking out of her Krista role, indirectly leading to Ymir Fritz breaking out of her Krista role. Eren freeing Ymir is also interesting if we follow the reading that every Titan is an extension of Ymir herself. The Attack Titan would naturally embody the part of Ymir who sees herself in the pigs and who wants to be free. Yet the previous chapter also established that the Attack Titan seeks freedom due to Eren seeking freedom. In this sense, Eren is metaphorically a part of Ymir herself, so this scene can be seen as the freedom-seeking part of Ymir that got beaten into submission, reuniting with her. It's also noteworthy how amoral this chapter is. Eren's plan is much worse than Zeke's, yet the narrative rewards him for fulfilling the theme of understanding, unlike Zeke, who sees her as a tool just like everybody else. Now, Eren's quote-unquote reward is the genocide of the world, and Zeke is likened to someone who's ideologically his polar opposite. Zeke is meant to parallel King Fritz, despite the fact that Zeke wants aliens and the curse to die out, whereas Fritz wants aliens to conquer and multiply and dominate the world using Titans. While this is obviously very different from what Eren wants, it's still much closer to Eren than it is to Zeke. Yet Eren is framed as the Fritz antithesis, whereas Zeke is the Fritz equivalent, because the chapter is not concerned with morality. It's more concerned with the interpersonal situation and how this girl just needs some warmth and some encouragement. That said, it wasn't really surprising to me when we learned later on that Eren's speech was not sufficient in freeing her. It was a crucial first step for sure. It made her consciously look for avenues to learn about the world and free herself, but when I read this chapter for the first time, I never got the impression that this was enough for her freedom. First of all, it would be really convenient if all she needed was just one speech to automatically decondition millennia of a slave mentality. Secondly, her choice to rumble didn't seem fully free. She made a choice within a binary that didn't really exist. She technically could have just done her own thing, and while it's true that her desires align with Eren's in the sense that she wants to lash out at the world, what are the odds that her vague emotional expression happened to perfectly align with Eren's plan? It's pretty clear that she felt the need to conform to the false binary presented to her, and while this is still a vast improvement over how she was before, it shows there's still work to be done in fully freeing herself. The rumbling was the grand payoff to this chapter, and I think it is absolutely perfect. There's no other way the series could have ended. Seeing Eren taken to this extreme was the logical conclusion of his character, and the Titan within the walls finally releasing in such a horrifying way after 100 chapters of build-up would forever stick with me. But another underrated aspect of the rumbling is how much it taints every preceding event in such a dark light. Every sacrifice the scouts make ends up leading to the genocide of 80% of humanity, whether it's Eren plugging the hole in the wall or the government being overthrown or Erwin sacrificing his life. Every single victory results in the most heart-wrenching outcome imaginable. It's very rare for a series to evoke this kind of emotion in me when looking back at old events. Levi actually seems to be aware of this, which is part of why he wants to stop the rumbling. In fact, the whole alliance of scouts and warriors do. And as characters whose point of view we follow around, they're alright, I guess. They're not bad by any means, but they gather relatively quickly and just brush off any potential friction in getting together. For example, they meet Annie after 4 years, and the most we get is a comedic scene, and then it just skips over Armin's dialogue to her. I'm not saying they should start duking it out or they shouldn't team up or whatever, but the section of the story feels bereft from basic human emotions. To be fair, there's a whole chapter dedicated to airing out these grievances, with the narrative purpose of working through these grudges and moving on through understanding. And there is certainly room for understanding, considering both sides have blood on their hands and both sides have done wrong to each other. But they are people, and that's obviously not going to eliminate any and all negative feelings involved before properly working through them. This is why we see the chapter largely focus on John's hatred for killing Marco, but that's about as far as it goes. The rest of the members barely have anything to work through. I'm not even expecting anything as explosive as what we saw with John, but maybe something indicating resentment or a short conversation or anything, but we don't. There's countless parts of these characters' histories that were never even remotely acknowledged by the characters who suffered. Porco's death, Armin killing Bert, Annie killing Levi's squad, and many other examples are all very real concerns that would likely cause at least a little bit of resentment, but none of it gets touched upon. Hell, Magath is even complicit in the deaths of the warrior's own people, but that's just a secret that he takes to the grave. All of this potential drama is brushed under the rug as they all did bad, so they all move on. I don't think this is because of the author's skills declining or whatever, but rather due to him writing himself into a corner. This is a fast-paced climactic arc where the characters are racing against the apocalypse, and at the same time we have to balance 11 major characters with over 100 chapters of conflict who must work through their issues in order to communicate the themes. Major compromises have to be made somewhere here. Character interactions are already lacking throughout the arc, but it feels particularly egregious here because of the immense narrative potential in this group and also because of the importance of the alliance. This isn't to say what we got was bad, but how am I supposed to be impacted by the theme of characters working through their past issues via understanding when the process to get there is so streamlined? It makes this chapter feel more like a formality. Maggot's apology felt the same way. But of course, there's still some excellent things at play here. John's arc is amazing for one. It was his season 1 arc, but repeated in a situation that challenges him much more. This hits hard because John was a perfect audience stand-in here. I also felt immense dread at the rumbling. I also felt that this is finally the opportunity for our characters to secure the survival of the country they spent so long fighting for, and I also settled on there being no option but this atrocity needing to stop. His emotions feel extremely authentic here, down to the immense discomfort and reluctance he feels at his final decision to stop the rumbling. I also generally like the idea of the scouts fighting for humanity and refusing to accept an outcome that saves Paradis at the cost of everyone else. These chapters also continue a prevalent theme in AOT, which is the refusal to sanitize heroism. The Uprising arc emphasizes that one must shed some blood if they wish to fight for the greater good. Connie confidently saying they'll save the world is critiqued by Elena, who points out how none of them can truly claim to be heroes when nobody in the group is free of sin. We see this idea play out during the port battle when the cost of having to stop the rumbling is thrown into our characters' faces, as Connie is forced to kill 2 of their friends. And of course there's also the acknowledgement that stopping this genocide endangers the island as well, which is a risk our characters sign up for. Fortunately though, our focus in this section is not limited to the Alliance, because we also get some neat flashbacks from Eren. One of these chapters is pretty cool. We see Eren reflect upon his past in the nature of how everything is set in stone, wondering where everything began, kind of like how Mikasa earlier reflects on her conversation with Eren and whether the rumbling could be traced back to that. The chapter focuses on 3 conversations with Eren, talks with Flock, Zeke, and Historia. All of these flashbacks paint a very coherent picture of Eren where each of them complete and parallel each other. For example, as his conversation with Zeke ends and he says that he wants his friends to live long lives, it cuts to the ending of his conversation with Historia where he tries to ensure his friend lives a long life instead of dying to the curse. In fact, his conversation with Historia in particular sticks out to me the most. It's a common sentiment that Historia being sidelined post-time skip is very disappointing, and I somewhat agree. It's true that it's impossible to have a long-running story with a large cast and not sideline anyone at any point, because not everyone can be relevant to the plot at all times. But the issue here is that Historia indeed was crucial to the plot. Her decision to get pregnant prevented the government from immediately trying to feed Zeke to her, which is a much bigger contribution to the plot than anything our major characters have. The reason this leads to disappointment is because we hardly get any insight into her psyche. Her feelings about the rumbling as it happens are not really explored in depth, nor are her feelings about her husband or how she feels about her friend's actions or any potential reflections on Freckles Ymir. The most we can rely on is brief disconnected snapshots and some limited dialogue, and to be fair, while I'm not fully confident in my following interpretations, I think what we can extrapolate paints an interesting picture. Eren sees Historia slipping back into her Krista persona by agreeing to sacrifice herself for the 50-year plan. So in order to convince her out of it, he tells her about the rumbling and has her support it by reminding her to stay true to herself and her selfish nature. She hesitantly complies and gets pregnant in order to aid the plan. On the surface, this seems pretty straightforward, but if you inspect further, there seems to be a much more complicated push and pull within Historia's mind state. Eren convinces her to accept the rumbling by telling her it's what the worst girl in the world would do, and then she seems to almost immediately accept it after being reminded of that. But is this really a decision the worst girl in the world would make? Because it certainly has the same aesthetics, but it doesn't appear to have the same spirit. She basically says that her choosing the rumbling means she wouldn't be able to live a life of pride, and her expression is distraught after immediately accepting it when she was told this is what the worst girl in the world would do. These give off the impression that this is not something she truly wanted. It seems more like she felt obligated to fulfill the role of the worst girl in the world, which is paradoxically more of a Krista thing to do. The whole idea of what she's supposed to do is diametrically opposed to what rejecting Krista meant. I think on some level she realizes this. She's locked into the shitty options of either the 50-year plan or the rumbling or letting Paradis die. None of these represent her true self. It's almost like becoming Krista is inevitable. This is why I think she asserts herself by proposing to get pregnant. Eren begins the conversation by proposing her 2 options, run or fight. This is an echo of the choice Levi gave her towards the end of Uprising, which was to run or fight. At the time, Historia chose to fight as a way to prove her newfound self-acceptance and rejection of Krista. This time though, her response was to reject that binary and to instead choose to resist by being pregnant. She got pregnant in order to aid the rumbling plan, but on her deeper emotional level, it was a reaction to making another Krista-like decision. Eren's words got to her on a more subconscious level by reminding her of the importance of staying true to herself, and the pregnancy is how she expresses this. This is more like what the worst girl in the world would do, creating her own third option as a rejection of what was imposed onto her. Of course, she is still miserable as she gets pregnant because she gets with a man she doesn't love and gets pregnant to abet her plan. This is why I think her true self-actualization comes with her loving and appreciating the kid that she gave birth to. This is a representation of who Historia really is. Despite conceiving the kid for reasons besides love, she still ultimately loves her kid. Her true self comes out as she is happy with the outcome of her asserting herself and enjoys the fruits of her selfish decision. I think this is why her post-time skip self is absolutely crucial to finishing her arc pre-time skip. Pre-time skip, she is told to either run or fight, so she fights. Post-time skip, she is told to either run or fight, she carves her own option. Pre-time skip, she accepts the role of a puppet queen with no executive power and beholden to the decisions of others. Post-time skip, she gains enough control to ensure the protection of people she wants to protect. While she had made a lot of progress in liberating herself by the end of Uprising, she was not fully self-actualized until the end of the series. Now that I think about it, this deepens her parallels with Ymir Fritz. Historia makes a decision to support the Rumbling to ostensibly reach self-actualization. Ymir Fritz makes a decision to cause the Rumbling to ostensibly reach self-actualization. Historia is only fully liberated when she appreciates her child. Ymir Fritz is fully liberated partially due to her appreciating her children. In fact, Historia's child seems to be the antithesis to Ymir Fritz's children, in the sense that her treatment is what Ymir's children could have and should have received. Ymir's realization was that she didn't love her children when she should have, whereas Historia actually gets to love her child in real time. Furthermore, Historia's kid is the first alien child to be free of the Titan curse, whereas Ymir's children are the first children to receive the curse. Historia's child was born in a hopeful age where the walls broke down and understanding became a possibility, whereas Ymir's children literally share names with the walls, which also serve as metaphors for lack of understanding. The contrast between these two characters goes to show how cycles don't have to be permanent and generational curses can end. Beyond that, I also think the decision to make Historia pro-rumbling was interesting because it paid off the contrast we saw between her and the rest of the scouts. While the scouts were idealistic and risked their lives for a greater cause, Historia only risked her life as Krista due to a death wish. There's also a more subtle contrast in terms of the no regrets ideology. The veteran scouts followed the mantra of not knowing the future, so they make the best choice they can with the information they have so that they don't have to regret their decision, regardless of the outcome. By contrast, Historia appears to base her regrets on post hoc rationalizations. For example, Historia only decides she doesn't regret her decision in the cave because it led to her helping kids at the orphanage. We also see her possibly try to retroactively justify her decision to herself by explaining how Royal Titans held back humanity and Eren being a shifter is better for humanity. She didn't seem to have any of these in mind as she made her decision to save Eren in the cave, because it was an explanation she appeared to have thought of on the spot in order to keep Eren from being fed to Rod. These instances show an inverse of no regrets, where she only retroactively judges whether a decision was good or not based on its outcome, rather than assessing it by whether she truly made the best possible choice based on what she knew at the time of making a decision. These contrasts she has with the scouts pay off in her making the very unscoutly decision to aid the rumbling. Her attitudes towards no regrets lines up nicely with how Eren's future memories also subvert the idea of no regrets, like I explained earlier. And speaking of Eren's future memories, the other flashback chapter is by far my favorite chapter in AOT, my favorite chapter in all of manga, and one of my favorite singular installments in any piece of media. It's something that's truly special, and I am in awe at the fact that Isayama crafted this while overworked on a consistent schedule. I think one of his greatest strengths in general is that he's very good at writing micro stories within the larger story of AOT. In these short 40 pages, he reaches emotional heights that are untouched by anything else in the series. The pure devastation of watching children and families get massacred, the sympathy for Eren feeling guilt about what he's about to do, the rush of mixed emotions as you see Eren feeling guilty about his own twisted motives, and the legendary freedom scene, which is the ultimate crescendo of the chapter, evoking a sense of ascension that contrasts beautifully with the horror we're shown down below. Definitely a unique emotional experience. But of course, this is also the most insightful chapter we get into Eren's mind state in the whole series. The chapter begins showing Ramsey, who was a kid we already saw earlier, so it creates a nice bit of continuity and attaches us to him immediately. However, he's also shown to be a parallel to Eren as another downtrodden kid with ambitious dreams to break out of the status quo. This is especially neat because he's also shown to be a parallel to Levi as another kid living in poverty who resorted to thievery and who got beaten for it multiple times. Levi's child self in general is shown to be a parallel to Eren with his frustration over the world and his desire to taste freedom. Levi, Eren, and Ramsey all seem to show the same issues plaguing each generation, Levi being the veteran generation, Eren the young adult, Ramsey the zoomer. However, Levi grew out of his frustration and adopted scout ideals, Eren stagnated, and Ramsey didn't get an opportunity to grow or change his situation. The point being that everyone is the same. Eren metaphorically killing his younger self reinforces the cyclicality of his actions, mirroring how Titans killed its people in episode 1. This chapter is a story of stealing people's dreams. Ramsey himself is literally a thief who steals from others in order to further his dreams, and Eren is also someone who robbed Ramsey from his ability to achieve his dreams. Nice and efficient storytelling. Eren walking around Marley is another highlight of the chapter. He is horrified at the mass death he'll cause as he sees the future victims of his actions. Or not really future victims, because the chapter jumps back and forth between past and present. Not only is it brilliant to see what Eren is talking about becoming fulfilled in real time, but it gives us insight into how Eren feels, with the future and present being the same for him here. We begin with him already giving himself the benefit of the doubt, claiming that the rumbling is fixed and that it's because of the failure to find diplomatic alternatives to the 50-year plan. But this is called into question when we consider that he hadn't fully articulated his full reasons for rumbling at the time of this thought. He sees a woman that evokes his mom, which is an exemplification of what Historia warned him of. He wonders what his mom thinks, which is not only heartbreaking but is also interesting because he begins to contemplate Zeke's plan before throwing it out because it's not in his nature to let Paradis die. I'm not saying that Carla would have a perspective as extreme as Zeke's, but the fact that Eren's mind immediately went to Zeke's submissive plan after thinking of Carla's perspective possibly hones in how Carla's docile nature contrasts with Eren's more aggressive nature, which tracks with how Carla is the one who Grisha selected and who made Grisha more family oriented. Anyway, he comes across Ramsey getting jumped, which demonstrates the self-fulfilling nature of future memories. It's his memory of Ramsey that arguably makes him feel the need to approach Ramsey, and it's his whole set of memories that prompt him into walking into the town that make him fulfill the memory of seeing Ramsey. His rescue of Ramsey and acknowledgement of the future never changing shows how much the memories are symptomatic of his nature. He can't resist his nature that compels him to save Ramsey, and so the future is the way it is. The language of it is important too because his description of "I guess the future doesn't change" depersonalizes him from the action. This goes to show how the memories are still trapping him in his desires and is also possibly to distance himself from the horrific outcome of his memories. Now Eren's emotions reach a boiling point and he cannot hold them in anymore as he breaks down to Ramsey and confesses his deepest desire. Because while external pressures did push Eren to the brink, the very fundamental core reason why he decided to rumble is to fulfill his childhood dream. Eren has always carried a latent frustration inside him. He's somebody who feels powerless quite easily and feels frustrated at the nature of civilization. The inherent conflict and power dynamics that are baked into humanity humiliate him and make him feel trapped. When Armin introduced him to the book, he saw the outside world as a potential escape. A pure world where he doesn't have to be burdened by the confines of civilization anymore. The walls and the Titans became the outlet for his frustration, and this finally shifted to the entire outside world. When he learned of humanity existing outside the walls, his ultimate disappointment was seeing more of Paradis on the outside world. Not just more, but worse, because the level of conflict and rottenness was to such an extreme level it threatened the lives of everyone he knew and loved. This is why the Eldia-Marley conflict is what disappoints him in the context of the series, because it's a situation that's symptomatic of what frustrates him about society as a whole. As such, in order to avoid feeling powerless like he has ever since childhood, he seeks to destroy the outside world and liberate himself. This is why after we watch Eren's confession juxtaposed with Ramsey's death, we finally see the freedom panel. The act of rumbling the outside world and removing these barriers to freedom give him a sensation of freedom. This is foreshadowed in season 1 when he mindlessly orgasms about freedom as he kills Titans. This is like a mini freedom panel and shows that just the act of removing barriers alone gives him the sensation of freedom. The reason behind this is because of something Isayama illustrated in an interview during season 3. The difference between Eren and Armin is that Armin values the sites as they are, whereas Eren values the sites because reaching them is proof of his ability to reach them and thus proof of his freedom. While this does not perfectly apply here, it tells us a lot about what Eren truly values. Eren's core insecurities revolve around power and control, which is why him being in the process of removing barriers makes him feel free. It's him exerting his ability to remove barriers, and ability is what Eren's desire for freedom boils down to. Of course, the irony here is that he's only able to feel this sensation because of how he is blocking out the horror he's inflicting. The smoke is covering it all up, and he reverts to a more childlike mind state, both as a representation of how he's fulfilling his childhood dream and also so he can feel the thrill as an ignorant child who is unaware of the consequences of his actions. Eren has matured at this point and has become conscious of the tragedy, which is why he cannot actually enjoy what he's doing without some level of dissonance. There's an extra layer of irony when you consider how much Eren is able to feel free because of ignorance. It is Eren's knowledge of the future that traps him, which is why ignorance would ironically be liberating for Eren, and this is contrasted against Eren's line from earlier. Many people have also pointed out the symbolism with how colossal titans represent walls trapping him, being the literal wall titans after all. It goes to show that this is just a brief, illusory sensation and that he's ultimately still trapped by future memories, by his desires, by his abstract standard of freedom that lies beneath his goals. He also says that he has reached that scenery. We know from the ending that the rumbling stops, so he's not referring to some hope for completing the rumbling, but rather the actual sensation itself. This tracks perfectly with his backstory. Armin brings him the book, and he doesn't start to crave escaping the walls until he sees the look in Armin's eyes. In a neat parallel with Kenny and Yuri, what he searches for is to feel the same thing Armin felt. His sensation of freedom and power makes him feel that, hence why it's that scenery, but at the end of the day, it's nothing more than a temporary sensation. Very sad. Anyway, amazing chapter. It was the culmination of important parts of Eren that were introduced to us since chapter 1. It felt like the logical conclusion of everything set up, and it's chilling for his innocent childhood dream to result in genocide. It's also perfect and in line with the rest of the story to make Eren go from some dark crusader who does what he has to do for his friends and country to someone much more selfish and fucked up who internally desires this on top of the external pressures. It completes his parallels with Reiner and elevates him to easily the best character in the series. Isayama in interviews has talked about how he's felt the same feelings of being trapped that Eren felt, having grown up in a small town surrounded by mountains. If I had to guess why this chapter is so masterful, it's because Isayama channeled his raw emotions into the story here. Despite all my issues with this arc, it's this chapter that makes me grateful it exists. Anyway, the alliance is still a thing. So we have a chapter where Hanji dies and it's pretty sad, but then we move on to a chapter which, upon release, made me very anxious for the climax of the series. To recap, the characters discuss why Eren is letting them move about freely despite having the powers of a god. Reiner thinks he wants to be stopped. Then Eren intervenes by explaining that he'll let them fight him because he respects their freedom to try and stop him. We're off to a very stupid start. None of this made sense to me upon reading because the concept of fighting them and the concept of retaining their freedom are inherently contradictory. If you are fighting them, then you're either trying to injure them or trying to kill them, both of which are seen as taking away someone's freedom from Eren's point of view. When you get down to it, really what is the difference between resisting using godlike powers and resisting using physical combat? The latter just happens to be more appropriate for an exciting battle climax. There's no reason why Eren should become a mega shonen fan and suddenly place so much stock in the act of actual literal physical combat itself. If anything, it might respect their freedom less in the sense that it has a higher risk of them dying compared to temporarily incapacitating them with founder powers. This also just becomes irrelevant when you remember that Eren imprisoned his friends for a much smaller benefit earlier in the arc, so it makes you wonder how much he really cares about their temporary freedom. So reading this chapter, we're left with three options, or maybe some combination of them. Either Eren is telling the truth, or Eren is arranging his defeat for some larger reason, or Eren is handicapping himself because he's indecisive and part of him wants to be stopped. The first option is nonsensical, the second option removes all tension, and the third option removes mostly all tension. Because why even have Eren go from committed to indecisive unless it's just to set up the final battle and his defeat? That said, we know in retrospect that Eren was probably lying here, so the contradictory nature of his speech doesn't mean I find the plot point illogical. But first of all, I don't think the story even realizes how little sense the speech makes. The Alliance never questions it, and even as Ymir is trying to kill them and they assume Eren is behind it, they never consider how much this clashes with what Eren said earlier. Second of all, even if it was a bluff, it still means there is like no tension when it came to whether the Alliance would win or not. The chapter has another weak part, which is Falco as the Jaw Titan discovering he can become a bird, because it turns out that him using Zeke's spinal fluid to become a pure Titan means he has Beast Titan powers. Now, the concept of shifters ingesting other Titan fluids to gain their powers isn't new at all, but what is new is the shifters gaining powers from the fluid that made them a pure Titan. Not just gaining powers, but also gaining memories. We never saw Eren or Reiner or Zeke or Armin or anybody just start off their Titan with a bunch of other Titan abilities as they received the Titan, and with memories of some random ass people who aren't even their predecessors. This is just a completely last minute thing added right before the final battle, which is lame. And even if we excuse all that, the timing of his Flying Titan memory only arriving now of all times without any specific trigger is very convenient, but whatever, I digress. What follows in the next chapter is beautiful. We see more destruction caused by the rumbling and it's gut-wrenching. And the scene where everyone is desperately trying to save the baby, a representation of hope for the next generation, is beyond haunting. And then we have a Marley in general monologuing all his regrets and seeing that the rumbling is a byproduct of Marley's hatred. The problem is, I don't think this is very realistic. Let's say you have a certain ideology engraved in your head since childhood. This ideology is largely centered around a specific country being dangerous and the need to eliminate that country because it can hurt you. Then you see that place about to hurt you, which is more likely. Confirmation bias kicks in, and this only further reinforces your belief that this was a dangerous country that should have been destroyed, or you start to reflect on your ideology and everything you've been told and realize that you made a mistake by believing in the ideology. Unfortunately, I just don't see the latter scenario happening with what we have. Does he at least add much from a thematic point of view? The ideas in his speech about how the world's hatred makes their fears come true was already communicated much more elegantly and impactfully in Declaration of War. This just seems like a really clumsy and unsubtle way of communicating those same ideas. Really, the most the speech adds is plot development because it's important for the Alliance to have an ally on the Marleyan side, but to get there we get something really contrived. I really wouldn't have minded if this was a pretty established character who has set up for reaching the epiphany he did, but we got what we got. It might sound like I'm nitpicking, but the reason why I'm really taking issue with these chapters is because this is the climax of the series. I would not have been too bothered if there was a similar issue in an earlier event, but everything has more weight in climactic chapters as everything contributes to our final impression of the whole series and to what gives meaning to previous chapters. And unfortunately, these problems just keep piling up. The Alliance have their entrance and the grand final battle of this whole epic begins, and it's dog shit. For one, until the very last chapter of the fight, this battle is literally just against a bunch of NPC zombies. I get there's like some deeper symbolic reason to have such an impersonal battle because it brings things full circle or whatever, but I don't really care. I don't think this should be done at the expense of a compelling climax. Compare this to the previous battles of the series. Shiganshina, our opponents, were 3 pre-established characters who had personal ties to the main characters. Liberia, we grew to love and care for both sides who had to destroy each other, and it was also heartbreaking to watch the civilian casualties. Shiganshina 2.0, the opponents were again firmly established characters who had personal relationships with the main cast. It's mind-boggling that for the final battle of the series, the most significant battle narratively speaking, we downgraded to a bunch of characterless drones. It reminds me of some MCU climax much more than the epic, gripping, intelligent, gut-wrenching, large-scale battles that pervaded AOT climaxes up until this point. It's also disappointing from a more technical side of things too. AOT, especially pre-time skip, had many of its battles be chock full of strategy, especially the climactic ones. AOT is generally a well thought out show. There were creative solutions to problems, and the back and forth strategizing made battles feel like chess matches. In fact, even when fighting pure titans, the series was still keen on developing interesting tactics to get rid of them. Unfortunately, this aspect of the series peaked with the Shiganshina battle and began to slowly decline after, but what's especially disappointing is it being at an all-time low during the final battle. We get some attempts to reach certain goals, and we get some basic division of labor, but there's still no actual tactical conflict the way AOT used to have them. The battle is won through brute force and last-minute magic. The climactic battle of pre-time skip is miles better by every metric than the climactic battle of the whole series, and that's just sad. However, by far the most egregious aspect of this is Ymir. Eren appears to be out of commission and Ymir is covering defense. She does seem to be genuinely interested in defending the rumbling considering how many kill shots the shifters go for, and this tracks with where her character mentally is at this point in time. The issue is, if she is trying to defend the rumbling and go after the Alliance, then why is she using past shifters? Why is she not using her godlike powers to resist? It's the same issue as earlier with Eren's whole freedom bullshit thing, except here, A, Eren's freedom explanation makes no sense as we've established. B, she has no reason to be invested in their freedom the way Eren is. Whatever the Alliance wondered about earlier about why Eren isn't stopping them was still left unanswered because Ymir's interests are also a factor. So on top of having a weak, underwhelming, and simplified battle, we also barely get any context for why they're battling at all. But there are also some major character beats within these chapters, namely Zeke and Armin. Now I'm guessing this video will turn out to be around an hour long, and I spent like half that time glazing Zeke nonstop, so surely his conclusion should excite me, right? Surely it'll stick with me as something profound and cement him as one of my favorites, right? Look, I don't hate his ending. It doesn't ruin Zeke for me, but it certainly doesn't stick in my mind whenever I think about Zeke. Zeke realizing the importance of life is fine. It's definitely where his character was leading up to. His worldviews consistently get challenged, so it would make sense if the climax of his arc was coming to terms with his birth. What Armin communicates isn't bad either. The idea of valuing the little moments ties well with AOT's themes of attributing meaning, which we see the scouts do with people's sacrifices all the time. It's the show's thesis on how to achieve personal freedom and learn how to be happy in your circumstances while still fighting for a better future. It pays off the natalist and life-affirming themes by showing that experiences give life meaning. In fact, when I see this panel in isolation, I get a couple goosebumps. But in the context of the chapter, this all comes about in a really messy and oversimplified way. We're introduced to Zeke after 15 chapters of absence, and he begins to spout some radically different ideas from what he used to hold. Zeke pre-rumbling was completely opposed to the rumbling. He didn't want Eldians to be born, but he also didn't want Eldians to die. And he definitely didn't want non-Eldians to die either. In fact, part of the reason he even wanted to sterilize Eldians was to protect the world from Titans. And here we see the world needing protection from Titans. Yet his views have completely shifted off screen into something much more nihilistic. He went from thinking Eldians shouldn't be born to everyone should die, probably as a way to cope with failing to prevent the rumbling. It's true that fundamentally he shares the same ideas as pre-rumbling Zeke, as it stems from thinking life is suffering, but the point is that this is still a major enough shift such that it changes his position on the rumbling in order to necessitate Armin talking to him. Zeke starts off anti-rumbling, then he disappears and off-screen becomes pro-rumbling, then 2 minutes later he's convinced into becoming anti-rumbling again, but this time by valuing life. It just feels contrived and inorganic, like something that was artificially set up so that Armin can talk to Zeke and he can have his moment as well. The conversation happens really quickly too. Zeke gives his philosophy in a monologue as Armin stresses over his friends, then Armin gives a monologue about the value of life, then boom, Zeke is instantly convinced. I acknowledge that there was a lot of build up to his eventual epiphany here, the biggest thing being Grish's apology to Zeke. Personally, I feel like this will only make the epiphany possible rather than make it quick. And even if I concede that it can be quick, I find it very hard to believe that it can be instant. Even a quick realization would still have some sort of gradual change in his demeanor, as Armin explains, some sort of pushback, some sort of back and forth. But all we get is his dumbass face right as Armin monologues, and then that's it. By proxy, this also dampens Armin's conclusion quite a bit for me. There's no explicit payoff to his survival's guilt, so if I had to extrapolate, it would probably be this. He's simultaneously realizing the little things in life matter as a way to remind himself he doesn't have to live up to the expectations of being Erwin, and he can be his own thing, which is what allows him to activate his true potential. But as we've gone over, since the setup for this conversation was so visibly contrived, I just don't feel any impact from Armin's payoff here. This moment also has me further let down by the larger battle going on, because what happens is that Ymir Fritz also gets inspired by Armin and becomes convinced that the rumbling is bad, so she allows Zeke to leave paths and allows them to use their own past Titan shifters to fight against the current ones. Levi then kills Zeke and the rumbling stops. Now, something I can credit this arc for is how much dread it instilled in me every chapter after the rumbling. Every single second that passes, more people are dying. Every second means potentially hundreds of people across the globe dying. It was an apocalyptic level threat, and it certainly felt like one. The opponents even have godlike powers, and one of these opponents doesn't seem like her powers are brought about by any physical form. It was a grand insurmountable issue, so stopping it would feel like a Herculean task, but instead we just get this chapter. First of all, Ymir. I don't have an issue with her being convinced by Armin to allow the end of the rumbling, as I think it's an important part of her character arc, but on page, while experienced in the chapter, it comes off very different. It comes off as the vague mystery box with godly powers instantly changing her stance and letting the characters win. By all means, this feels more like a victory handed to our protagonist rather than one that was earned through immense sacrifice or clever strategy. My other problem is the way killing Zeke is such an uncomplicated solution to ending the rumbling. I guess I can buy the idea that Zeke was consistently fueling the rumbling, since I don't see any other reason why the founder would keep his body. Although I do find it funny that the Alliance was able to reach the correct conclusion with such limited info. The issue here is that I expected a much less straightforward solution, and these weren't some random arbitrary expectations, these were based on actual plot points that were shown to us. Much earlier in the show, we're told that the Wall Titans would move if they make contact with sunlight, yet here the Titans just instantly stop after the founder stops controlling them. I don't think this is wrong information, it would be very bizarre writing if it was, and I guarantee nobody thought it was wrong until they reached this chapter and saw the Wall Titans stay still. It's also shown to us at the end of season 2 that Eren's founder powers expired long after the Royal Blooded Key died. These aren't necessarily contradictory to what we saw. I can and did conjure up my own elaborate explanations for how it makes sense, but there's a difference between something that's implied and pre-established, even if implicitly, and an elaborate set of rules I came up with after trying to spot niche differences between these scenarios so I can retroactively think of an explanation of how it doesn't contradict. The readers had perfect reason to believe that killing Zeke would not suffice in stopping the rumbling, and that there would be further complications, but that just does not happen. The issue is simplified so our heroes can have a win. To be fair, it's not that there's zero pushback after this. Eren becomes a colossal titan somehow and is about to restart the rumbling by reuniting with a titan worm he got separated from. In fact, the worm even titanizes a bunch of people, including our main characters. These raise the stakes and help give the chapter a very hellish and chaotic vibe, something that Mikasa desperately wants to escape from and does when she experiences the cabin dream, which is a fantasy that Eren and Mikasa live out. Mikasa was often a representation of home throughout the series, carrying on Carla's wish to protect Eren and thus being an extension of Carla, who also represented home to Eren. However, the more time passed, the more she focused on doing her duty and benefiting the greater good, even at the expense of her loved ones. This is why the dream here is nothing more than a fantasy that never came to pass. Both of them got to satisfy some small part of themselves that wanted to flee from it all, while Eren uses this dream as a test run for Mikasa. He dies of the curse in the dream, and he uses this to help Mikasa mentally prepare for his death in real life, urging her to forget about him. However, Mikasa does not seek to forget about him. The feverish vibe of the chapter ceases as Mikasa seems to gain more lucidity. She instead accepts him and uses his memory to empower herself, killing him while also acknowledging her love for him. The grotesque image of her kissing a beheaded Eren encapsulated the idea of beauty and cruelty, which is a central idea to Mikasa. This chapter is absolutely the strongest one in a while. I don't think it's perfect. My issues with the final battle aren't really erased. Eren's defeat still feels too clean cut, and I haven't gathered enough interest in Mikasa and her relationship with Eren up until this point for me to feel maximally impacted by her decision, but it was a solid entry nonetheless. Now the real highlight here is the ending of the series, Eren's conversation with Armin. To preface, I think the manga chapter of the ending 139 is absolute garbage. I see it as a crappy SparkNote summary version of the real ending, which is the anime ending. Actually somewhat like the anime ending. So that's the version I'll be talking about. Eren explains to Armin what will happen. He did the table talk to try and make them heroes, Ymir Fritz will be freed by Mikasa, and the curse will end. That's mostly as far as it goes when it comes to impersonal exposition. But there's an interesting backdrop with how they begin as children and slowly mature throughout the conversation as they watch the sights they've always wanted to see, as if to show them living out their childhood that they missed out on. One of my favorite scenes is when they both gaze at the lava and Eren looks at Armin's expression. It reinforces what I said earlier with how Eren wanted to feel what Armin felt, but it feels especially powerful here because you can sense a hint of longing here, of envy, of resentment. There's also the vibe that Eren is suppressing some truths as he shifts the conversation away from talking about his attempt to make them heroes. We see these truths come in full force in the most ugly fashion imaginable, as Eren reveals he killed 80% of humanity. After Armin feels distraught and rages at him for doing something that would likely crush people's hope and understanding, Eren admits his actual core reason is for himself and his desire for freedom. He admits he's just a reckless idiot who was given too much power, a run-of-the-mill ordinary guy. This is an extension of what he learned from his conversation with Shadis in Uprising. He's only special by virtue of everyone being special. He's still an ordinary guy who is granted this power. After all, Armin himself also has some part of him that wants to wipe out the world. This frustration with the status quo and abstract desire to destroy everything is inherent to humans as beings who seek control. AOT largely tackles human nature, and humans in general have many more similarities than they do differences. This is why you could put literally any two characters in the series and find all sorts of ways they parallel and foil each other. A lot of these emotions are universal. This gives us room to understand each other, which is what the Alliance's philosophy is all about. In general, I love the conversation between these two. It's rife with drama and emotion, and the idea of Armin feeling equally culpable and thus bonded to Eren once he's dead because of their shared sins is beautiful. The bloody seashell is a perverted version of their childhood dream, showing how both of them have stained their hands in order to reach a place where there is some sort of hope for the future. Their dynamic remains one of my favorites in the series, and this anime adaptation only further cements that. Eren becoming one with the past, present, and future due to the Fallen Titan connecting him with Eldians across all time is something I want to discuss. There seems to be two different interpretations of this. The first is that the past, present, and future are all a byproduct of Eren's desires similar to his future memories, and he is still bounding himself in that way. It's like the Grisha twist but applied to a much larger degree, with Eren's will embodying the whole story, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other is that he has literally lost any and all free will due to being one with time. In this sense, his desires have become irrelevant and he loses control over the story after the rumbling activates. It's controversial, and I was initially hesitant to adopt this take, but once the anime version came out and new lines were added, I became quite confident that the latter was being intended. If we take a look at the scene where he explains how he led to his mother's death, he said something along the lines of, "The past, present, and future are all the same, so I had to do it. It was not his time to die, so I had to redirect her away." This phrasing stands in stark contrast to the usual phrasing where he'd imply he has to do something because of his nature or whatever. The closest comparison would be when he said the future doesn't change, in reference to him saving Ramsey and fulfilling a future memory. He never said anything like, I saw a future memory of me saving Ramsey and so I had to do it, I had no choice but to save Ramsey. He simply remarks the unchanging nature of the future after his desires fulfill it. This is because at the time he was still a person existing in the present. He had glimpses into the future, but him still being a person made it so his desires were relevant to fulfilling them. However, once he became the founder, he merges with all of time and thus becomes a separate entity pretty much. After activating the rumbling, his will becomes irrelevant and everything moves on autopilot. He can't adapt and he can't influence the story from this point onwards. More evidence of this can be found earlier in the arc when Zeke's Titans are ravaging Paradise right after activating the rumbling. Armin wonders why Eren doesn't use the founder Titan to eliminate them, since Eren literally has nothing to lose by doing so. After all, if the timeline is shaped by Eren's will, then why does his will constitute letting Zeke's Titans roam around? Before I thought this was just a really weird plot hole, but now I realize that this question was supposed to make us wonder how many actions Eren as a founder can really take, and the payoff is the reveal that Eren does not have any. He loses all influence. This also explains why he couldn't slightly change the conditions to make it so Hanji doesn't need to kill herself. Evidence can also be found in the new anime lines. Eren directly says he attempts to exterminate the outside world before he gets stopped. He does not say that he attempts to exterminate as much as possible before he gets stopped. No, he directly says he makes an attempt to go all the way. This does not track with the idea that Eren deliberately arranged his defeat at the hands of his friends. And it is impossible for Eren to lose without letting himself lose, unless he simply does not have godlike powers because he has lost all control. This also tracks with his story later on, saying that the life his friends got was not the life he wished for them. What seems to be the case is not that Eren actually wanted his defeat, but rather that Eren saw his death and saw the end of the curse through his lack of further future memories from successors. He gets this knowledge when he kisses Historia's hand. He does not know how far he goes. It could be 20, it could be 80, it could be 99, it could be 100, but he knows his death is inevitable. Since this is after he gets the founder, and since his death is very likely not of his own doing, this outcome is out of his control. It's not like seeing a future memory of you eating chicken, it's more like seeing a future memory of an unstoppable hurricane. However, since Eren is largely basing this on assumption, he is not certain of how he dies. It's possible that Eren dies at the hands of his friends, and if he had to die, he would rather it be at the hands of his friends so that they can be heroes and fight for Paradise's protection in case too many people end up alive. This is why he used the little power he had to try to push them away and make them heroes through the table talk, which, let's be real, had no effect. Beyond that, he never actually does anything to try and make them heroes. He does not willingly let them fight him, he's forced to let them fight him because that's just how things are supposed to be. This lines up better with the themes of the ending. The whole point is that it's everyone's decisions that shape reality. Eren is a slave to the timeline now, and it is everyone's choices that shape the timeline. This is a greater manifestation of the idea of Eren being selected by the world to become what he is. The story that everyone created literally becomes him and determines his actions. Now, in terms of value judgments, do I like this? Well, I can say for sure that I don't like the alternative explanation when accounting for the events of the arc. In fact, I've held the alternative take for years, and it's actually a big reason why I used to hate the ending until the anime. If we assume that Eren had genuine godlike control over all of Eldian history until 139, that makes the plot very convoluted and becomes almost impossible to suspend my disbelief. It means that Eren's will shaped everything because this result was just that important. Apparently, this outcome is worth the deaths of thousands of Paradisians, Sasha, his mom, Hanji, and whoever else died as a result of his decisions, whether through action or inaction. It's extremely hard to believe that what we got was the least costly way to get to the final outcome from Eren's point of view. This would be an overcomplication that was tacked on just to reinforce an idea that was already established. The other issue arises with Eren arranging for his defeat, because if he has godlike abilities and had his friend stop him, while it does not explicitly contradict his character, it's surely an uncompelling way to end it off. What would happen in that scenario is that Eren settles for less of a freedom sensation by allowing himself to rumble less. He'd put Paradise in a much shakier situation than if he went all the way, especially in the manga where the outside world is able to rebuild at a faster rate than what's realistic. He'd put his friends in a very crappy situation of having to shoulder the immense burden of trying to broker peace, while also constantly being on the verge of death themselves. If Mueller was slightly more paranoid or racist, everything Eren sacrificed for would have been down the drain. The same would have happened if people from the outside world who doubted the truth of the story assassinated them, or if Jaegers assassinated them. The only benefit to Eren making all these compromises compromises would be the end of the curse. Yet the conditions to end the curse and how it necessitates his defeat were only revealed at the very last minute. In that sense, it feels like these variables were introduced to justify diminishing Eren's commitment to the goal he initially wanted to reach and make him half-assed on everything he desired, which might be fine with more proper on-screen development, but in 139's case, it's far too late for that. Now, everything I just yapped about is only a rant about a hypothetical interpretation that I once held. My understanding of the ending is different now, so I do not have these criticisms anymore. But by its own merit, do I like the fact that Eren lost all influence after getting the founder? Is this a good narrative decision? Well, it's certainly very arbitrary. One strength about pre-founder future memories was that they were not arbitrary, in the sense that they could not be anything. A vegan cannot randomly see a memory of eating chicken and then want to eat chicken because of that. But here, a vegan can see a vision of eating chicken and then be forced to eat it just because. There's no other factor preventing the memory from being any different. Before, the other factor was the user's desires. Pre-founder Eren can't just randomly see himself shooting Armin in the head because that's not something he'd ever want to do upon seeing the memory. It felt very organic in that way. Here, it very well could be destined that Eren shoots Armin in the head and nothing would stop that. There's nothing that made it so that Eren had to let his friends fight him. It's something he had to do just because. There's no reason why that had to be destined. It's very lame and random and strips him of agency in the most boring way possible. The other issue is that this is a really last-minute development. The reason I think this interpretation isn't more widespread is because it's incredibly unintuitive to accept the idea that Eren is just following arbitrary destiny things after the series spent several chapters painstakingly establishing how crucial his desires are to making future memories what they are. Yet in the very last chapter, we're suddenly introduced to this whole new thing that requires a whole other separate understanding from what was established to us for a dozen chapters already. Besides that, some things are also just really unclear and underdeveloped, like paths is a separate realm from time, so Eren seems to be autonomous in paths, yet Eren in paths is still egging on the Alliance to fulfill a future memory he apparently doesn't want. Has he lost control in those moments too? Does he have to egg them on because it's destiny even in paths? I don't know. However, I don't think it's the most appalling of issues. It's last minute and vague and robbed him of agency for the past several chapters, but that's about it. It doesn't really ruin much of what I loved about him. It adds an awkward stain onto a conclusion I find otherwise good, but besides that, it only alters my understanding of his actions from the last several chapters, like letting Hanji die or whatever. It doesn't break anything when I try to look back at the series as a whole. This ending has some other really weird dumb things that don't ruin too much, but still blemishes my final impression of the series. Prime example being Ymir Fritz. Now, I don't have any issue with Mikasa being the one to free her. I was lucky I read the manga as it was released, so I got to digest the final panel of 138 for a month. I didn't know what was going on with Ymir, but it was obvious that her freedom or victory or whatever was tied to Eren's defeat. Naturally, I wasn't really shocked when I learned that Mikasa killing Eren was what liberated her. There also are some parallels between the two that contrast them. Mikasa thought she was a slave because of Eren's lies about Ackerman, but she realized she wasn't. Meanwhile, Ymir Fritz is the only literal slave in the series. Mikasa is also the embodiment of pride, and it made sense that her managing to put the greater good above Eren inspired Ymir to put the greater good above the king. I don't have any problem with this, even though I get why people do. I also wasn't surprised at Ymir loving the king. I thought it was already heavily implied that she had some bizarre attachment to the king, so a second-hand source describing this attachment as love did not radically alter my understanding of what was going on. A lot of people also seem to get the impression that Ymir was orchestrating a grand plan to free herself, whether it was before meeting Eren or after. I don't think anything suggests this is the case though. It just seems like Eren put her on a path to free herself and she lashed out with a rumbling while being more open-minded to learn about the world, so she heard out Armin in his conversation with Zeke and was convinced not to continue the rumbling, and the final straw was Mikasa showing her how twisted her attachment to the king was. Her learning to value the little things from Armin allowed her to realize she should have spent more time with her kids instead of simping for a monster. It's a pretty simple journey. I don't think it's particularly interesting beyond the foiling I talked about, but it works. For the most part. After all, there's still gaps in her character, like why she wanted to use past shifters to resist the Alliance, like I said before. Things complicate further when you take in the nature of founder powers. Eren was able to see the full past, present, and future of all Eldians due to the founder, and we know Ymir is able to do the same because she was able to look at Mikasa's whole past life. It doesn't make sense if she knew about everything that freed her since the very beginning of Paths. It seems more likely that she retroactively looked at Mikasa's life, either right after Mikasa killed Eren or after Ymir possibly learned about her through Eren's memories when she made contact with him. So in order to preserve the integrity of the series and not make it so that for 2000 years she already knew everything that she was taught later, I'm just gonna assume that this is not actually a founder power, but some new power both Ymir and Eren gained after making contact with each other. It's a reach, but I'm being generous. But this still has issues, right? Because if she only gained full future vision after Eren talked to her, this still means she had experienced everything, like Armin's talk and Mikasa's decision, before she even learned from them? Does this mean she had actually learned her lesson the second Eren touched her, but she just felt the need to go through the motions so that her past self here can learn the lesson? So does this mean she didn't make genuine emotional shifts as Armin and Mikasa did their things? Did she maybe just not see what she learned from later because her mind was jumbled? I don't know, this is incredibly messy. And this becomes even worse when you accept the interpretation that Eren's found powers made him lose all control. Because shouldn't this also mean Ymir lost control if she had the same powers? Does this mean every single thing she did after the rumbling was also on autopilot and what she was forced to do for some arbitrary reason? Even though we know the motivations behind her actions, overall it just does not feel like the author thought through Ymir's mechanics very well. And that causes major problems when trying to make sense of her journey and her psyche, which is unfortunate because she is the crux of the ending's plot. I can't talk about the ending without also talking about the Alliance though, and their conclusions are whatever, I guess. Reiner is particularly underwhelming. His dynamic with Eren was central to the series up until the final arc, yet alongside everyone else we don't even see their final conversation with each other. Reiner was considered the main character of the other side, being our set of eyes in Marley, so it was disappointing to see him relegated to the same importance as characters like John or Connie. To be charitable, I think I can see some thematic relevance in this. We start off with Reiner and Eren being the same at the end of Marley, then this expands further as the theme of everyone being the same rears its head and Connie and John commit actions that are supposed to parallel Reiner's actions early in the series, hence their more even focus. This theme then gets taken to an extreme as Eren literally becomes every Eldian, connecting with all of them. However, this is just a retroactive justification to slightly mitigate my issue at best. After all, we still see Armin and Mikasa clearly being given more focus. The theme of everyone being the same does not mean some characters should not get more emphasis than others, and this results in an incredibly disappointing conclusion for Reiner, which is really just his mom deciding to make amends with him. There's this very strange trend in the final section of the story. A character gives up something in order to make the right choice, and as a reward they get the thing they gave up as well. Reiner gives up his desire for approval from others and tries to save the world for the sake of helping people, and as a reward he gets approval from his mom and also from the world as one of the heroes who kills Eren. Annie gives up meeting her dad in order to help her friends, and as a reward she gets to meet her dad. Shadis gives up his glory seeking, and as a reward he becomes the hero he's always wanted to be. It's a very bizarre and Disney-esque way to write, and lame when you consider how much AOT emphasizes making sacrifices and difficult choices. There are some exceptions though. Mikasa is the main one. After all, it's not like Eren came back to life. She had to live the consequences of her decision and learn how to move on. John is also somewhat of an exception. The anime makes clear how being a hero is absolutely not the rosy life he gave up by stopping Eren. It's a very high-risk situation where they have to fight an uphill battle to prevent a war. I'm also pretty okay with Levi's arc post-time skip. My enjoyment of his character did suffer from the time skip and his following lack of interactions like I said before, but his arc with Zeke is fine. He gives meaning to Erwin's death by killing Zeke since that's what he promised Erwin that day. I mean, how you attribute meaning to things is subjective, so instead of stressing over Zeke, Levi could have just accepted that Erwin's death already had meaning by making Zeke retreat from the battle, but whatever. I don't mind too much because I don't think it's framed as a revenge mission which he's supposed to overcome. Him wanting to kill Zeke is more so framed as his responsibility to the scouts rather than an act of vengeance, and he never prioritizes killing Zeke over the greater good since that would go against the whole point of giving meaning to Erwin's death. He made some mistakes and rash decisions, but they seem to be based on other emotional factors, such as him not wanting Eren to be fed or him misunderstanding Zeke. Him killing Zeke is a cool moment for him because it's not purely a straightforward victory. The only time Levi got to kill Zeke is also the only time these two characters were ever on the same page. His final moment was strong too, him shedding a tear at the curse finally ending when he's the last of the original scouts standing. Overall, Levi post-time skip was an underwhelming experience but still had some strong aspects nonetheless. Interestingly though, the scout who had the biggest change in my opinion from manga to anime was Armin. For most of post-time skip, my opinion on Armin remains intact across both mediums. Armin's quality was dented due to the time skip just like every scout. The amount of praise and hype he gets in the series is wildly disproportionate to his actual contributions to the final battle, and one of his final climactic moments was incredibly weak for reasons I went over. However, final impressions do matter, and my final impression of Armin is much better in the anime. This is mostly thanks to how the conversation with Eren went from inhuman and robotic to something much more rich and enjoyable. Beyond what I already talked about, it also has the effect of making it feel like the whole series is tied together here. I did not get that impression in the manga. But Armin expressing his own personal frustrations and inclinations, illustrating the universality of these emotions, and his heartbreak at Eren's rumbling crushing the hope of future generations all contribute to making the series feel much more cohesive. I get the same impression with this scene on the boat too. The added line about how everyone's choices shape the future is not only a good callback to Uprising, but makes makes me feel like everything in the story up until this point has been properly acknowledged. Every single person in the story matters, not just Eren, in the outcome we reach. It's a culmination of the suffering and the resistance of every character who has been affected by the war at this point. It places a responsibility on people to do their share and make choices to at least try to strive for a better world. Despite all the criticisms I have of the climax and the ending, it still leaves me feeling like the series has something to say, and it's saying this by weaving together every aspect of the show. I don't think the message is particularly profound, but I do think it was executed really creatively throughout the series and makes everything feel tied together in a way that few large-scale dramas manage to do. But then, right after that is the bird scene. Really corny and sloppy way to communicate the idea that Mikasa is choosing to acknowledge the beauty in Eren's memory and have that lift her up. I also don't know why this was the last scene we see before the credits, but on to more interesting stuff. We see Paradise after God knows how many years being bombed. I think it's cool that the city is shown to be so highly futuristic to the point it's unrecognizable from the Paradise we know. Making it far removed from the series especially hones in the idea that conflict is inevitable even despite people trying for a better world. This is just a reality of things, but it doesn't mean people should not strive for anything better. We have seen success with the alliance between each other, and we have even seen success with Paradise's survival up until this point, so the goal should be to try and replicate these successes as much as possible even with the grim realities of war. About the kid who approached the tree, I don't have much to add to something that's been extensively discussed for years. Titans were a result of Ymir's wish at the time. The curse continued because of her specific mind state in paths, so whether the following outcome will be positive or negative depends on the boy's wish, and the contrast between his curious mind state with a friendly dog and Ymir's panic state chased by hostile wolves points to the fact that the outcome will probably be positive, and the ambiguity is to make us wonder whether the new generation has learned from history to make improvements. This is all well and good, I don't disagree with it, it's interesting. But if I had to add my 2 cents, they're quite reachy, but there's some fun thoughts I had. So if you run with the idea that Ymir turned into a titan because she wanted to survive, then that means the worm doesn't seem to inherently enlarge organisms. But then why is it that the trees are bigger too? Well, consider that trees and nature compete with each other in order to get the most amount of sunlight possible. Maybe the worm is granting the wish of the tree by making it really big, giving it a lot of yummy sunlight, and also eliminating competition by preventing the growth of nearby trees in order to give it space. This means whatever the user wants does not have to be a conscious wish, it's just responding to very basic primal needs that are encoded within the user's DNA. After all, that's probably why it survived since the Cambrian era. It's really good at establishing symbiotic relationships and granting organisms their needs. Then that makes you wonder, what are the odds that 3 out of 3 times we see the worm affect an organism, it was through making the organism bigger? Well, Zeke does talk about how Ymir Fritz in all life fear death, which is what led to the Titans, but I think it goes further than that, because what does this fear of death lead to? It leads to a desire for expansion, a desire for control, a desire for power. This need for control is almost universal to life, as life attempts to reach certain outcomes in order to reproduce. The Titans were a manifestation of Ymir's fear of death, and so they were a manifestation of her desire to gain power over the situation and survive. This is why the specific act of becoming bigger is so common among life affected by the worm. It demonstrates more control and dominance over their environment. This ties into AOT's themes of Eren's feelings being near universal. He wanted power over his situation, which led to frustration, which led to him trying to exert power through the rumbling. On further thought, this adds another dimension to why the walls, and consequently the Titans, are represented as barriers to understanding. The Titan is a manifestation of Ymir's fear of death and also her expression of power. It is this expression of power that leads to the cycle of hatred perpetuating. Whether it's Marley seeking resources in order to expand its colonial rule, or Reiner breaking down the walls in order to break out of the status quo and deal with his insecurities, or Eren rumbling because of his disappointment with the outside world. All of these boil down to a very primal feeling of seeking power over one's situation, and all of these halt to understanding. I think this is why animals are used to represent the dog-eat-dog world of AOT, as if to show these aspects of humanity predate humanity itself. It's also probably why the Titans are mindless beasts, since they represent Ymir's and humanity's ancient bestial feelings related to fear and control. Everything ties together. Very neat. Anyway, those past few minutes were a lot of waffling. That actually goes for this whole video, honestly. It's just one big hour-long waffle fest. But it was fun. I enjoyed. Let me know in the comments what you thought, the things you learned, the things you find interesting, the things you agree on, the things you disagree on. Because there's no way you're gonna 100% agree with everything or 100% disagree with everything. It's a very chaotic arc, both in content and in quality. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Bye.